Okay, so I think we all agree that this is by far the most difficult chapter in the whole book. So I will do my best to try to um, bring some clarity to it. However, I fear I won't be able to do magic. So, you know, the things that are mentioned here in the cartoon are still very much pertinent to this particular presentation. Okay, so in order to be able to understand what the heck it is that Plessner is doing in this particular chapter, we need some background, okay? And we need to start with these two smartly attired and very grimly looking gentlemen, namely Wolfgang Köhler and Hans Driesch, whom we already met. But here's the thing. You constantly have to bear in mind that everything that Plessner is doing here is basically an attempt to try to find a middle way between these two extremes, between Köhler and Driesch. He said that explicitly before, and he's basically constantly doing this. However, he doesn't mention it. But some of the statements that he makes are basically constant discussion with these two authors. So on the one hand, we have Wolfgang Köhler, a proponent of physicalism or neo-physicalism. What do I mean by that? Köhler, as a Gestalt psychologist, tried to introduce the notion of Gestalt into the field of physical phenomena, and he based physical and biological phenomena. And the main point that he made was that organisms do not necessarily have to be understood as aggregates or classical machines. Instead, they can be understood as physical Gestalten, that is to say, as functional unities in which a whole is more than the sum of its parts. So you basically have these dynamic unities in which all the specific segments of the unity are somehow correlated in a way that constitute this particular whole that cannot be reduced to the sum of its parts. On the other hand, we have Hans Driesch, the infamous neo-vitalist, who disagrees with Köhler. He says that although this is a move in the right direction, still we cannot say that organisms are physical gestalts. Instead, we need to understand them through the concept or through the lens of wholeness. So he introduces this notion, the extra worldly notion of entelechie, which is something that accounts for a specific wholeness that is present in living beings and cannot be found in physical gestalten. And the main thing that he somehow attributes to this wholeness is autarky. So this capacity of determining its own conditions of possibility. So not only does the living organism behave as a whole, that is to say that all segments or aspects of the living organism change in unison when something is disrupting its equilibrium, but it can also determine the conditions under which it will be able to do so. So this is something that is not captured, according to Driesch, in the notion of functional unity. Plessner's via media is basically the following. He is he agrees with Driesch and opposes Köhler in the following. He says that there is an essential difference between the inorganic gestalt and organic wholeness. So Driesch is in the right here. However, he disagrees with Driesch and is in agreement with Köhler that this does not necessarily lead to vitalism. So there is no need whatsoever to end up in a neo-vitalist position. And he feels that boundedness or positionality is a way to get there. So some of the key features of positionality that we've covered so far. So first of all, the notion of boundary in living beings. So living beings are beings or things that not only are their boundaries, but also have their boundaries. So they are able to position themselves with regards to themselves and with regards to their surrounding. That is to say, organisms or living beings encompass both what they are. So organism is both what it is. This is something that pertains to the Köhlerian dimension. but they are also that what it is not. Okay, the organism is also that what it is not, at least not yet. And this is precisely what is the Drishian dimension here. That is to say, the organisms are out beyond and also into. So they are always one step ahead of themselves, but they are also one step behind themselves. You can also think of this in Husserlian terms. Living beings are beings that have both retention and protension. Okay, so they have this horizon that is surrounding the snapshot gestalt, the physical gestalt. And this is what he calls positionality. And what is so special about this positionality, according to Plessner, is that it allows for a processual, that is to say, non-dual logics. It allows us to think about a certain entity in a way that makes the dynamism, the activity, as an integral feature of that particular entity. And then he went through several different phenomena, several different things pertaining to the living beings and tried to thematize them. So for instance, when he was talking about the relationship between the living beings and its milieu, he said that we have to think of this relationship in terms of connection separation, that is basically that these two dynamisms are actually two aspects of the same process, of the same phenomenon, and not something separate. He said that we need to think about living being as processes, that is to say, as something that is constantly undergoing a change, but in such a way that also retains a certain permanence. Again, we have two aspects of the same phenomenon. And then he also tried to thematize several other phenomena, such as death, part, whole, temporality, and so on and so forth. I will not go into these, or I will touch upon some of them merely incidentally. So this is the overview of the chapter. At the beginning, so the first part is basically the crucial part that isn't really separated in the chapter itself. It's basically about the relationship between Gestalt and system, or Gestalt as whole, and which ties in with his understanding of the organ again. So this is basically something he starts off the whole chapter with, and is crucial for understanding all the other points. So the points colored in red are the points that we'll be covering today, and the points covered in blue are the points that I will be covering next time. So this presentation, today's presentation, will be slightly longer because I have to kind of try to make sense of this first point. And once we have this, I think that it will be also easier to then get into some of the topics in the second half of the chapter. So let us start with this first point, the point that is probably the most strange and dense and obscure in the whole chapter. So this is basically the point where, again, he's debating Köhler and Driesch. He doesn't say it. However, he's constantly trying to find a middle way. And this will become hopefully clear when I go through the notions that he uses. So one has to be really careful about terminology. Because he tends to use different designations for same concepts. Okay, so the first thing that we have to bear in mind are the so-called Gestalt holes. Okay, what are Gestalt holes? This is basically the holes that Köhler talked about. This is the part of the organism that tells us organism as it is. So this is the organism as it is. Yeah, and this is also something that he refers to as a functional unity, or as a unity in the variety of its parts. Basically, what this is a physical gestalt. You have a variety of parts which become interrelated in such a way that the whole becomes the central point of their conjunction. That means that whenever this whole changes, it changes as a whole. So the relationship between the specific aspects or parts stay the same. This is basically what is a functional unity or a Gestalt whole. And Köhler talks about different examples, soul bubble, electric conductor, and so on and so forth. We don't have to go into that. However, Plessner says that living beings are actually systemic wholes. So this is the Dresian element. So this is the out and beyond and in. So out, beyond, and into part of the living being, of the organism. Plessner also calls these systemic wholes unities for themselves, or unities in and beyond the manifold. Now, what is a systemic whole? Systemic whole is basically the same as a Gestalt whole, but it also has an additional feature, namely a self-sufficient center. So what happens is, in a certain sense, we are witnessing a doubling of the synthetic center. So not only is there a center in the sense of a central point of conjunction, so point number 2 in Gestalt whole, but we also have what he refers to as a second or deeper core. This is a self or a subject of having. This is the center, the virtual center, we might call it, which is space and time-like, or space and time claiming. It is not something that is actually present in space or time, as the central point of conjunction of a Gestalt whole is. Okay, so bear these two understandings or notions of whole in mind, please. Gestalt whole on the one hand, systemic whole on the other. I will use the acronym FU for Gestalt whole, functional unity, and systemic whole SU for the systemic unity. Okay, so FU and SU, these are the two acronyms that I will be using. Now, here's the thing. Plessner, again, tries to solve the tension between these two aspects in a way that will not end up either in reductionism. So he doesn't want to pursue the Köhlerian path, nor does he want to end up in some sort of dualism. So he doesn't want to pursue the Dresian path. Okay, so the only way that he will be able to solve this is that he somehow introduces the self-referentiality of the body towards itself. So the living body has to somehow refer back to itself. There is a certain recursivity present within the body, or as he puts it, the living body is the whole that has the body and that is had by it. Put differently, the living body is the whole that is a systemic unity and that is a functional unity at the same time. He then explicates this somewhat. Yeah, he says that living body as a body that is characterized by positionality is both the subject of having and the object of having. It is both the unity for itself and the unity in the manifold parts. Or if we use the terminology that I've introduced previously, it is both the systemic unity and the functional unity. Living body as an object of having, as a functional unity, is a physical gestalt, which means that it is an actual actuality. Those are his terms. This is what is actually given when I look at the living body. This is what is given in my sensual intuition. I see a physical gestalt. However, it behaves in a very specific way, which kind of bespeaks of another center that is both within and above this particular unity that I see. And that is what he refers to as a systemic unity. So the living being is also an actual possibility or a potency. It is always over and beyond itself and moving towards the realization of a certain potential. Okay, but how can we then solve this tension between these two dimensions of the living body, yeah, between the systemic unity and the functional unity? He tries to solve it through the notion of unfolding. So it is only through the idea of activity that he thinks that this can be solved without ending up in either of the two extremes that he doesn't want to end up in. So he will try to explain how the systemic unity unfolds in the functional unity. That is to say, how the systemic unity actualizes itself in and through the parts that consist the functional unity. Okay, this is what he sometimes refers to as the empty passing through. And again, I would like to underscore the importance of the logics of activity, this processual logics that he's trying to develop. Okay, so unfolding, this is basically something that he introduced already in the previous chapter. He says that the only mode in which something non-spatial, in this case, this would be the systemic unity, nevertheless exists as an extensive variety, as a functional unity. Or to expand on this, non-spatiality, which is characteristic for the systemic unity, and spatiality, which is characteristic for functional unity, cannot be together in ideal simultaneity. They come together only in the mode of passage. So only in process can they be interrelated. From non-spatial into spatial variety, whereby what was previously non-spatial must have had the status of actual possibility. Okay, but how is this possible? Well, by means of organs. Now, let me try to explain. Okay, so what is an organ? Plessner is kind enough to actually provide a definition here of an organ. He says that an organ is a relatively delimitable, functionally and morphologically specialized subunit of the body as such. Okay, so it's something that is functionally, morphologically specialized within the body. But why does he introduce organs? This is what he says. This is basically me paraphrasing some of the points that he's making. According to Plessner, the organ prevents the living body as a uniquely structured physical body, as a functional unity, okay, as a physical gestalt, to completely coalesce with itself. Okay, so it basically prevents the reduction of the living to the physical gestalt, to the physical material. Okay, that is to say, while the living being is what it is, that is to say, while it is the functional unity or gestalt unity, it is also both outside and within itself. This is something that, according to him, organs provide. Now, at this point, he hasn't explained why this is the case, but this is why he thinks they are important. Okay, this is the crucial thing. They prevent both sliding into the physicalism, because they prevent the functional unity to completely coalesce with itself. But at the same time, because they are morphologically specialized subunits, they prevent sliding into vitalism. So they are key factors. They are something that is given, you can see them, but at the same time, they are over and above what you see. They are, in a certain sense, miniature versions of organisms themselves, if you like. Yeah. So why is this important? Organ, he says, has two characteristics. One is it is autonomous or semi-autonomous. That is to say, they are specialized and they are, in a certain sense, at least to a certain degree, self-sufficient. Okay. However, despite this autonomy and specialization, they are also always open. Why? Because they are always interrelated with other organs, which co-specify what these organs are doing. So there is a certain specificity and certain autonomy of each organ, while still being embedded into a meshwork of a system of organs. Okay, for him, this is very important. Why? Because if you only have what he calls a harmonious equipotential system, what you get is basically a physical gestalt. That means that the whole is present in all of its parts directly. And this is basically the extreme that he wants to avoid. However, organs introduce what he refers to as harmonious divergence of organs. So there is this autonomy of organs, and this is crucial because then the systemic whole cannot be present directly in all of its parts, only mediately. Okay, So the bottom line here is that organs, because of these two characteristics, are in a certain sense topoi or nodes of unfolding. So previously we said that the only way that you can combine these two aspects of the living body as a subject of having and the living body as an object of having, the living body as a systemic unity and the living body as a functional unity, is through the notion of unfolding. Now, organs are basically the nodes or the topoi, the place where this unfolding occurs. That is to say, an organ is that in and through which the systemic unity actualizes as a functional unity. And he says a lot about this, but I'm going to just briefly summarize it. As far as an organ is autonomous, it is a hindrance. That is to say, it is a mediator. What does that mean? Organ function as that which delimits the ways in which the systemic unity can actualize itself in the functional unity. So because it has an autonomy, because it has a certain way of developing, because it is has specific specialized characteristics, it delimits the way in which a whole, which is over and above the gestalt that is given, yeah, can actualize itself. So once the development of organs starts, it narrows down the possibility of the actualization of life, so to speak. However, because all organs are also open, that is to say, they are co-specified by all the other organs, it is also what Plessner refers to as the furtherance of life. That is to say, it is the means or that which enables the systemic unity to actualize itself through functional unity. Okay, so at the same time, it is an anchor because the organs are something that is specialized and is in a certain sense semi-autonomous. It is an anchor and it kind of delineates the limits, the way in which the systemic unity can develop. But because they are never self-enclosed, they're always open and they're always co-specified, and not only spatially but also temporally, it is also that which allows for the systemic unity to actualize itself through the functional unity. It is that which allows for the systemic unity to be over and beyond functional unity. Okay, so if we now go back to that idea where I said that, you know, he's trying to solve the Köhler Driesch problem by this self-referentiality of the body, by body being both the subject of having and the object of having, and by introducing the notion of unfolding, we can now put more flesh on this understanding, on this notion of unfolding. Why are organs so important for this idea of unfolding? Because we now see that unfolding actually means becoming of the means of having. We said that organs are the means of the means for the systemic unity to actualize itself in the functional unity. So basically, unfolding means the becoming of the means of having, or the becoming of the subject systemic unity. So it is through the development of organs that basically this dialectical relationship can occur. This is the best I could do. Yeah. Okay. So now that we have this overall picture, overall scheme, we can try to explicate this a little bit more. So all the next steps, in a certain sense, are both implications and explications of what we've just said. Okay, so we said that the relationship between the functional unity and systemic unity is actualized through the physical carrier, which is basically organs an organ which is embedded into a functional unity of organs. Okay, so again, organs are the topoi in which this unfolding occurs. Okay. We've said, however, that even though organs are autonomous, yeah, this autonomy is relative, which means that they are always open. they're always open to the functional unity of organs. They are always co-specified by something that is other than themselves. Okay, so this means that if the systemic unity is actualizing itself through the organs, which are semi-autonomous but always open, this particular unity that gets constituted in this process, so the functional unity that gets constituted, is also open. It cannot be completely autonomous. It cannot be completely closed. And this is where he introduces the notion of positional field and the circle of life. Just like each organ is open and is co-specified by the other organs, so the functional unity of the living being, as basically a constellation of these organs, has to be open. It is never closed. Yeah, it is always open to its positional field. It is always open to the field that stands against it and that is its necessary complement. And he says that in this way, we have basically come to the point where we see that the organism is in fact not a completely autonomous unit. It is a semi-autonomous unit. That is what I said, that organs are in a certain sense miniature versions of the organisms. Yeah, they are basically a mirror image of the boundary dynamics that is happening within the organism itself. So what we get is a more comprehensive whole, which he calls the circle of life. And within the circle of life, we have two poles, two aspects. One is the living body and the other is the positional field. And the living body, as we see, is merely one aspect of this broader, more comprehensive whole, which means, again, that the organism, although it is semi-autonomous, what does he mean by this semi-autonomy? That the scope and nature of this whole of circle of life is in the organism's power. And then he specifies this by saying that the whole cannot put forward anything to which the organism is unable to respond. I will say a bit more on this when I touch upon the notions of adaptedness and adaptation. But the notion of autarky, please remember, this is the notion that Driesch ascribes to the organism. Plessner now says that the notion of autarky can only be ascribed to the circle of life as a whole. So to this more comprehensive whole. Only this more comprehensive whole is autarkus, okay? And the organism turns out to be, as he puts it, absolutely needy, demanding supplementation without which it would perish. One thing that I would like to point out here, and this is a pretty neat one, even if we don't necessarily understand it completely, what he's trying to say is that the organism is never fully or completely centralized or anchored. It is always mediately centralized, okay? It possesses a mediate centrality. What do I mean by that? Well, it is differentiated from within, so it doesn't possess a fully self-centered, it is not fully self-centered internally. So from within, it is basically separated into organs, so it is never fully self-centered from within. But equally, it is also not fully self-centered from without, because it needs to be supplemented from without, from the positional field. Okay, so neither is it fully self-centered internally, nor is it fully self-sufficient externally. So in a certain sense, there is no resting place for the living being. The living being is precisely this process, this ongoing process that is characteristic for the positionality or the logics of positionality. Yeah, because it is not fully self-centered within, and because it is not fully self-sufficient from without, it has to constantly compensate for this lack of absolute centrality. It has to constantly posit its own centrality. Yeah, it is basically forced to be dynamic. And in this regard, I was reminded when I was reading this that life here is basically comes very close to what Jonas referred to as needful freedom. So this life that is circulating within the circle of life is, on the one hand, it has an autonomy, but this autonomy is always a dependent autonomy. It is dependent on the parts, and it is always dependent on certain elements that are over and above it. Yeah. So it is an independent dependency, if you like. Okay, so moving on to assimilation and dissimilation. We already said that the living body is in a very specific relation to its surrounding, to what now we know is its positional field. This could be, also referred to as a milieu or an Umwelt. It's a similar notion. On the one hand, it is connected to this particular field, but on the other hand, it is also separated from this field. And this is basically something that is, again, that are two aspects of the same process. In order for the living being to be separated from the field, in order to function as a one semi-autonomous aspect in the life circle, it actually has to be connected with the field, because it is through connection that it acquires all the elements to maintain its self-autonomy. Yeah, and it can only be connected by maintaining its self-autonomy. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able, the notion of connection would make no sense. You can only talk about connection when you have two semi-autonomous units. Okay, so the thing here is that these two movements, connection and separation, are actually two aspects of the same movement. But Plessner now asks, how the heck is this possible? So how is this connection separation possible? Can we perhaps put more flesh on this process? And he says that why this is possible is because there is a specific split happening within the organism itself. And I've kind of already alluded to this split when I said that organs are kind of miniature versions of the organism. So he says that this split, he calls it with by different names. For instance, he says that the organism is disintegrating in itself, or he says that it is falling out with itself. And basically, this falling out with itself designates, again, a twofold process. So a process with two phases, namely the phase of deconstruction and reconstruction. So the organism is constantly engaged in a circle of deconstruction and reconstruction. Deconstruction is what opens the organism to the outside. Reconstruction is what separates it. So when the organism deconstructs, this is where it opens up. This is where the flow of physical-chemical of chemicals can happen. And when it reconstructs, this is when it posits itself as a unity, as an organization which is separate from its environment. Okay, so because there is an ongoing circulation between reconstruction and deconstruction, it is because of this process that the connection and separation is constantly happening. So this, in a certain sense, is very close to the notion of autonomy and autopoiesis. Okay, and he says the following. Again, why are organs crucial here? Well, organs are precisely the loci where this happens. Organs are these nodes in the framework where this process of construction and reconstruction is happening. Why? Because they are the loci where you have the ongoing dynamics between assimilation and dissimilation. Yeah. So assimilation and dissimilation is basically here a physiological correlate of these, let's say, broader categories of deconstruction and reconstruction. So this is what accounts for what he calls as an unstable balance of living matter. What does he mean by this unstable balance of a living matter? Well, the simple fact that in order to self-preserve, the organism has to constantly self-abandon. That is to say, in order to be able to constantly maintain itself, to construct itself, it has to constantly deconstruct itself. So the preservation and abandonment are, again, crucial for the unity that is the living being. It is not like self-preservation is the key feature of the living being. No, these two aspects have to be interrelated if we want to have if the phenomenon that we are confronted with is to be called living. A very nice way of articulating this is by a phrase that a certain philosopher, Brady, used. Namely, he said that the living beings have to become other just to remain the same. Yeah, so they have to constantly self-abandon in order to self-preserve. Or put differently, we have this, again, constant interrelation between closure and openness. Yeah, or again, we could use the Varelian terms here. We have, this comes very close to this conceptual distinction between what Francisco Varela calls operational closure and thermodynamic openness. So this idea that living beings are operationally closed, while at the same time being thermodynamically open. Okay, finally, the last section. Okay, so the last section basically touches upon the relationship between the organism and its positional field. So he hones in on this particular question. So how are these two interrelated? And he says that he provides a very brief history of these organism-environment relationships. At the beginning, there was this idea of the invariability of species, where it was just presupposed that, you know, there's a fixed number of species and that they are perfectly adapted to their environments. With the emergence of the theory of evolution, this was kind of negated. And here, the notion of adaptation was introduced. So basically, the organism is always somehow in a mismatch with its environment and has to somehow adapt to that particular environment. So the non-adaptation has the upper hand. Then with authors like von Baer and Uexküll, this idea of adaptedness was revitalized, was revived. So the idea that, but look, if we look at the living beings, we see that they fit very nicely into their niches, into their milieux. So they are already somehow in sync with their positional fields. Okay, so we have two positions. One is the adaptedness. This adaptedness emphasizes the immanence. That is to say that the positional field is basically immanent to the organism. This particular position emphasizes the primary coordination between organism and its positional field. So it emphasizes a harmonious reciprocity between these two. He says that according to this position, the organism fits into its positional field like a metal fits into a mold. Okay, and whenever you see certain dissonances between the organism and its milieu or and its positional field, this is on account of either external forces, or we basically ignore these dissonances. We try to minimize them. They're of secondary nature, and we either don't know how to account for them, or we say, well, you know, this is something that is introduced secondarily to this primary harmony. Here, nature is usually understood as something harmonious, and it is through, he says that, you know, very often there are like romantic ideas attached to this, where the abundance of species somehow emerges from nature's primordial ideas. Then on the other hand, we have a different picture, which negates this primary coordination and emphasizes the need for an ongoing adjustment. This is the position of adaptation. And unlike adaptedness, which emphasizes immanence, adaptation underscores transcendence. So the fact that the environment or the positional field is something that is outside, over and above, something different. Okay, so here the organism basically becomes a plaything of all the mechanical forces. And the synchronies that we see between the organism and the environment are only temporary and always have to be re-established. So the synchronies are somehow anomalous. Dissonances are basically what is the fundamental. Unlike nature being a harmonious web, as it was in the adaptedness picture, here nature is a cruel mistress. So the organism has to constantly strive to decrease the disruptions that the organism is facing. Now, according to Plessner, these two positions are superficially antagonistic, but actually are two sides of the same coin. Namely, adaptedness emphasizes connection, but is not able to account for separation. Put differently, it emphasizes this relationship in accordance with, but it overlooks the importance of the equally important relationship in opposition to. The question that emerges here for all the positions that argue for adaptedness are: what of dynamism, unpredictability, arbitrariness? We constantly see these arbitrary happenings, these little unpredictabilities that occur in the relationship between the organism and its environment. And the potential problem that emerges here is that basically the positional field can end up just becoming something that belongs to the organism. So as in Uexküll, sometimes one has the impression that the milieu, the positional field, is basically a construct or an extension of the organism. On the other hand, the proponents of the other view, so the view of adaptation, emphasize separation or the relationship in opposition with. However, they overlook the connectedness, that is to say, the relationship in accordance with. Here, the question that emerges is: what of fundamental synchrony and fundamental or factual equilibrium that we see between the organism and its positional field? The danger here is that positional field can simply become a zone of total alienness. So something that is completely detached, severed from the organism. Plessner tries to solve this again by means of positionality and by means of what we were saying before, namely this relationship, connection, separation. We saw that the living being that is characterized by positionality is in a unique relationship with its milieu, which embraces both connection and separation. So it is both in accordance with its positional field and in opposition to the positional field. Now that we have introduced the notion of the circle of life, whereby we saw that the organism is merely one aspect of a larger whole, we can say that the organism is, on the one hand, part of the content of the positional field. So we could say that it is wedded or embedded into the positional field. However, it is also always out and beyond this positional field. It is what he calls an eccentric center of the positional field. Yeah? So on the one hand, the natural place that is characteristic of the organism is part of the positional field, but at the same time, the organism, because it is a systemic unity, not only a functional, that is to say, gestalt unity, is also out beyond and into the positional field. Put differently, while embedded into the positional field, while there is a certain connection between positional field and the organism, it is also its eccentric central point, that which is set apart as its virtual center. So there is also the relation of separation. Okay. How can we understand this? Well, the relationship of connection or in accordance with is basically something that pertains to the organism as a functional unity. Yeah, because functional unity is basically a gestalt unity, a gestalt whole. That means that the organism as a functional unity is open to exchange with its environment. This is the domain of cause and effect. Yeah, there are ongoing circulations of energies and physical chemical factors and whatnot. Yeah, so this is basically how connection is possible. But at the same time, the organism is a systemic unity. It is a proper whole, and in this regard, it is closed off from its environment. This is the domain when we talk about the stimulus and response. In the first case, when the organism is construed as a functional unity, we see that the relationship between the organism and its positional field is reversely oppositional. This is basically characteristic for all physical things. However, organism as a systemic unity is irreversibly oppositional to its positional field. Why? Because it constitutes what we might call an autonomous unity, if we again use the Borelian terms. So this establishes a certain unstable balance. And we see that this is closely related to this ongoing circulation between assimilation and dissimilation, yeah? Integration and disintegration. This is what allows the ongoing connection and separation, as we said. And in this light, we can also see why Plessner's position allows for both adaptedness and adaptation. So both can be present. Neither of the two needs to be overlooked or ignored. Adaptedness pertains to the form of the living being. This is where the synchrony happens. So because organism is always embedded in the positional field, the circle of life, in a certain sense, makes sure that there is a certain synchrony between the two aspects. What do I mean by that? Plessner would simply say, if you want to talk about the living, about living phenomena, this already presupposes that there has to be a certain synchrony with its environment. Because if there weren't this synchrony, you wouldn't be able to talk about living beings as such. So on the formal level, that is to say, on the level of how the living beings are structured, on the level of its formal dynamics, there will always be a synchrony. However, with regards to contents, there is a need for an ongoing adjustment because the milieu is constantly changing. It's like on the physical chemical level, it's basically constantly changing. So the organism has to adapt. But whatever the positional field will throw at the organism, it will throw it in a way that will be recognizable to the organism and that it will be able to respond to it. So there's like a primordial relationship or connectedness or synchrony between them. So to wrap this up, this final section, the element of adaptedness refers to the organism as a systemic unity, that is to say the organism that is into and over above itself. And this systemic unity provides for the normativity. So it provides for the normativity in light of which the organism as a gestalt or functional unity will adapt to its environment. And because we have said that the systemic unity is also that which is not yet, so that which is kind of thrown ahead of itself, so to speak, the organism can always already anticipate what is about to happen. And if things go wrongly, if they don't go the way it is expected, it knows how to adjust to this error, precisely because of this adaptedness. Because there is adaptedness, it can meaningfully correct its mistakes. However, again, because it is also a functional unity, that is to say, a gestalt unity, it is thrown into the energy in the physical chemical flux, which is full of alterations and changes, and these are unexpected. So it will constantly have to find ways to adjust to these changes in different parameters in its surrounding. So yeah, that's basically it. That's the best I could do. Everything above that would be beyond my capacities.
Mm.
Yeah, I can see by the faces that this was a very elucidating, very clear.
Well, maybe I would start with in a different way than usually and ask you specifically, what is your takeaway from this? What is the insight which you think is really amazing about this chapter that's useful for explaining the phenomena Plessner deals with in comparison, for example, with competing theories? What's your takeaway from this?
Okay, so my takeaway is first of all that the attempt of solving the problem, the Driesch Köhler problem via organs simply isn't convincing to me. So even though I was kind of doing my best to try to present the best possible interpretation, it is not really convincing to me, because at some point he basically, what he's saying is, what else could perform this particular function? You know, it's almost like if somebody were to ask him, why the heck, why organs? You know, why are you so kind of focused on these organs? His response would be, well, what else is there? What else is there that could perform this function? And to me, this is just not particularly convincing. And I also see what he's trying to do, that he's kind of trying to show that organs are, in a certain sense, still within the realm of something that you can account for by means of Gestalt terminology, but because they are semi-autonomous, they don't allow for the same explication as physical Gestalt. But still, it's kind of, especially given his overall approach, where he's basically trying to deduce specific features from boundedness and positionality. This just seems so kind of ad hoc. It doesn't feel like he's deducing. So that's the negatives part. But now the positive part. Okay, so the positive aspect of this whole thing that he's doing is something that he doesn't really articulate, but that is present in all of his kind of explications. And that is that, in a certain sense, he's trying to show that there is a certain logic of dynamism, a certain logic of processuality that is inherent to living beings. And that basically, if you want to understand life or living phenomena, you have to be able to take this on board, and you have to be able to understand this logics and take it as fundamental. So whenever you're talking about living phenomena, you will have to be able to understand that separation and connection are basically two aspects of the same process, or that change and permanence are basically this part of the same process. And what he's trying to do is he tries to find ways to articulate this, sometimes more, sometimes less successful. For instance, I found the parts where he talks about assimilation and dissimilation and construction and deconstruction interesting. I think he ultimately kind of lacks certain concepts that would be similar to, say, an autopoietic system or autonomous unit, which would help him a lot there. I think that he would genuinely be happy if somebody said, hey, you know, there's this guy in Chile who kind of came up with this notion. This would be useful for him, I guess. And also this relationship between adaptedness and adaptation, to a certain degree, it's interesting. But yeah, so these would be the positive aspects. So this, let's say, progressive unfolding of the logics of unfolding, progressive unfolding of the logics of processuality, in a certain sense. This necessity of dynamic thinking. So the importance of dynamic thinking when it comes to vital phenomena. This would be my takeaway message. Yeah, Susanna.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. I find a lot of similarities between Plessner's talk, especially in this chapter, and in activism. Like, so do you know if there's like how the influence of Plessner was or has been in activism, or if they just happen to be getting to the same? No,
as far as non-existent. From what I know, Andreas Weber introduced Plessner and some other philosopher, biologists to Francisco towards the end of his life. There was no time. Francisco was ill by then, gravely ill, and there was no time to basically kind of go through these difficult texts and integrate them into the approach. So I think that for the most part, it is merely on the level of the recognition of similarities and somehow being part of a larger, let's say, theoretical, conceptual tradition or something like that. But in terms of direct impacts, there haven't been any as far as I know.
and not even in, for example, Ezequiel y Paolo developments, like this idea of adaptivity and this clarification of the processes of dialectical processes of self-production and self-distinction.
I don't think so. I should probably check that out, but I as far as I know, I don't think so. Maybe if somebody knows, Timotei has been reading up on Di Paolo, so maybe he knows.
Yeah, I don't think so as well. I mean, from what I've read, the main book, Linguistic Bodies, and a few the most known articles written by him don't mention Plessner. He relies on Hans Jonas heavily, but not Plessner, to my knowledge.
Yeah. In the paper on the teleological thing about with Kant, Weber does mention Plessner, but he doesn't actually it's in a different point. He doesn't actually go into any content or anything. So yeah, I did my master's thesis on comparing inactivism and Plessner, and I found no obvious link. Like, you just have to make it yourself essentially. But I know that throughout the Ouroboros seminars that we had, everyone is constantly talking about, yeah, we have to look into Plessner because there's so many similarities, but nobody really does it in the end. And I guess we're kind of finding out why nobody does it in the end, because it's a mess. And you kind of want to compare it, but then you're not really sure. Do you understand what Plessner is actually saying this? Can I put this in precise enough terms? I know I made some comparison in a master's thesis that I, like, in retrospect, I wouldn't have made, or I would have made in a different manner, because my understanding has completely changed in certain respects, or gone more precise or more muddy.
Yeah. Laura?
Maybe just like so that I can understand more what Plessner is saying. What would he respond to proponents of the free energy principle? Like, I'm just like to get a better understanding, like where the difference is between like contemporary ideas about the organism and his. Okay, that's an interesting question. Maybe first I would ask Timotei to outline the relevant aspects of this, or maybe either you can do it first, Laura, and then Timotei can do it, and then I will try to intelligently, hopefully, respond to your name. I'm guessing that you're kind of the direction that you're kind of pointing at is this anticipation and self-correction. Is that it? Yeah, and I mean, like in the free energy principle, like the reduction of surprise and yeah, kind of like keeping an homeostasis. Yeah. So yeah.
Okay. Timotei, would you like to add something first, and then?
I mean, yeah, I don't really know where to begin. Like, yeah, there's a lot of ins and outs to the free energy principle. But I guess the one thing I would say is that this is the only like really the most prominent current thought current of thinking that is like heavily systemic in investigations and in cognition and well, the question of what is life in general. Like I haven't seen. I mean, of course, you could say that in activism is systemic as well, but I guess the free energy principle would be the kind of computationalist, like the marriage of the computationalist and the systemic approaches that's currently prevalent. Systemic in the sense that like you have to start with some sort of conception of what the organism is as a unity, as a whole, because this is the parameter that enables you to measure and the specific quantity, which is you call the free energy. That's the way I would read it. Like in the sense that what is surprising isn't, I mean, in the framework of predictive processing, what is surprising is still measured in terms of some sort of internal model, right? But in the free energy principle, like you could understand it as a kind of generalization of the predictive coding and predictive processing frameworks, where you say, okay, yes, but this model is somehow tied to the adaptivity success for a specific organism that is making use of that model, and in that sense, it is somehow tied to the entropy, to the actual physical quantity of entropy that the organism is trying to minimize, right? Like this is going back to the Schrodinger's idea, like that the main function of the organism is to lower entropy in the sense that it's trying to sustain some sort of stable organization, right? So in this sense, it ties back to these ideas of operational closure, and specifically connects the idea of operational closure to this idea of prediction, that in order to minimize this quantity, in order to minimize entropy, what you actually need is to minimize informational entropy of the model which represents the kind of being that you are in the environment that poses such and such challenges to your stable organization. So this is the basic idea, and this, I mean, in this sense, I would say that of course it ties nicely with any sort of approach which starts with the proposition, with the presupposition that the organism has to, that the main function of any kind of vital process is to sustain some sort of vital identity, and that the main function of cognition is to aid in this process. So if we can inscribe Plessner into this sort of framework, then of course yes. But actually here I would have some questions, like whether Plessner in fact is claiming or starting from the presupposition that the organism is something necessarily self-identical. That would actually be my my response, my question to your question, actually. So can we actually claim that this is a kind of that this goes parallel to ideas of operational closure?
Yeah, this is precisely, I think that this is precisely his the point is that you cannot conceive of this attempted self-identity in statical terms. So because the organism is necessarily dynamic, it never coincides. So in a certain sense, you know, it tries to maintain itself, but with every attempt, what it is maintaining is changing. So it kind of reaches always beyond itself in a certain sense. So this is in a certain sense precisely the point. This is why he talks about the functional unity, because the functional unity is basically something that would be static or it eventually would just kind of, you know, establish a certain thermodynamic equilibrium, and it would maybe even cease function or just be there, or I don't know what would happen. But there has to be something that retains this specific polarity, and this is why it is systemic unity. It is something that is kind of so this was interesting. At first I was thinking that he was talking about kind of, I wasn't clear about how to draw the correct distinctions, but the point is this: you have organism that it is, and this is the organism as a functional unity, because whenever you see an organism, you see a physical gestalt, yeah? But there is also an organism that is beyond itself and within. And this is the same. It's the same movement. It's the same darn movement. These are not two movements. This happens at the same time. So the organism positions itself within in such a way that it's always following what is ahead of it. So this is you know, what I wasn't getting. You have a certain now snapshot, but at the same time you have a retention moment and polarity ahead of it. So this going over and above and within, this virtual self, this is the thing. The virtual self is not just tied in with going in. It is also tied in with going beyond itself, because he says that it is only if there is a certain futurity to the organism that the organism can actually position itself in the now. Only then can organism even have a now. So this is kind of, whoa, that was an interesting recognition for me, because he never says it. He just kind of throws these things out, and you don't know how many relations there are. So Philip and then Letitia, were you also okay?
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting way of maybe segueing into the question. I was most interested in his discussions of adaptation and adaptiveness, and particularly is we could put this into some kind of framework by looking at it in terms of what is a fairly vague, but I think important critique of the Darwinian model. Let's say if we could summarize the Darwinian model, and maybe even further than he does, you might say on one hand, there is an inertial principle. I would say the principle of population. So things are being forced continuously from behind by this principle of population. We have environmental niches in which the organisms are being forced into, and if those change, then organisms themselves change, so that the adaptation is always because of this push of the principle of population. And so we have then natural selection and the Darwinian account of all of this. He seems to be saying something that I hear that is interesting, a little different, because first of all, he's not relying on that kind of dynamism. I'd say the force of population to force things to change. He's got some kind of inner principle, although he doesn't want to consider this a kind of vitalistic principle, but he wants to talk about it in terms of this other, and that is developing a kind of interaction with changes in the environment, so that there is going to be this, but there's going to be a realization, and I think essentially an internal teleology in the organism itself to somehow achieve a certain kind of ends, which is put more into a dialectic relationship with changes in the environment. And I may have this wrong, but at least it seems to me that that's kind of interesting insight, since it's where a lot of contemporary questions about Evo, Devo, and others are going, is trying to develop models in terms of giving some activity to the organism rather than the neo-selectionist mechanistic models. Now, I may have that wrong, but at least to me, it seems to me he's saying something interesting here, but maybe I at least elaborate on that if you think I should.
No, I think that's actually correct. There definitely is this inner teleology that is present. I wasn't able to completely get what he was saying about it in the previous chapter, but I just remember that what he was constantly emphasizing is that you mustn't think of this teleology in terms of as if it were a carrot in front of a horse.
Yeah, well,
basically something that is kind of happening in the process of the unfolding itself. So it is contained within the process of actualization or whatnot. So I don't know. I'm still kind of thinking. So I'm thinking about this particular question also in terms of the questions posed by Laura, and it's an interesting one. I'm not. So
yeah, this is where I mean, I have to admit, a lot of times I'm trying to translate this into some concepts I might feel more familiar with, but it seems to me something inherently Aristotelian about the argument here, in the sense that there's an inner purposiveness, an inner dynamism that is not externally exposed, but within, that is achieving or reaching toward, to some sort of fulfillment of a life, of some kind of life program. So you have, I mean, in De Anima, he speaks about efficient, formal, and final cause all being embodied in the notion of what he wants to call suke. But it seems to me that he's not using that kind of language, and he doesn't ever make references to it. But it seems to me that he's saying something like that. And so we're restoring to the organism. It's not simply a passive object that's being acted upon either by external physical forces.
yeah,
there isn't an interaction, but nonetheless, there's going to be an internal dynamism that is not vitalist. I think this is an important point. Aristotle is not a vitalist, and I think that's sometimes mistaken in that point. Dries
yeah,
is.
for sure.
Dries is, and I think that, I mean, Dries is trying to reformulate these terms in some kind of neo-vitalist, and I see him working, you can say, working between a kind of physicalist view and a neo-vitalist view that gives this sort of inner that is pushing back, but in a somewhat dialectical relationship of the inner dynamism of an organism and the external environment, we might say. But I may have this wrong, but maybe someone can clarify it or has got it better. But
no, I think that's correct. But yeah, maybe if somebody else has any thoughts on this, and then I'll try to share. But
I mean, I have some thoughts, but do you want to switch topics or?
no, on teleology first.
No, so you should go first.
I don't really have that much to say. The only thing I would perhaps so one thing that I think he was saying in the previous chapter, or maybe it's even this one, I can't remember, but later on. So he says something like, the thing is that he's trying to keep this ongoing relationship between the systemic unity is kind of opening up the field of actual possibilities, but once it, so the every cycle when it unfolds, so when it kind of, when the organ starts to develop, and it starts to develop in a very specific way, the realm of possibilities shifts and changes and is delimited. So you have this ongoing process where with the development of the organs, with the materialization in a certain sense, what happens is that this domain of possibility changes. So what I'm thinking is that teleology here may be something that is relegated to the domain of actual possibility, and it is not something that is kind of pre-prescribed in the sense of this, only this and only this will happen, but only that within something will happen within a specific scope. And you don't really know the breadth of the scope until you have seen different organisms of a different individuals of the same species going through the same process. So different species, different individuals of the same species kind of actualize possibilities in very unique ways within the bounds of what is possible for this particular, what he calls then, what does he call it again? Gestalt idea or something like that. So what I'm trying to say, Phil, is that maybe with him, unlike with Aristotle, this teleology is something that is, maybe he would say that Aristotle still thinks about the possible too much through the lens of the actual. So that you know, that what is required is like a more proper understanding of the possible in a certain sense. Maybe, but
that's good. That's good. I think that's important. That's a good clarification. Yeah.
That's just yeah, some. But Letitia wanted to say something, and then maybe Timothy, if you have some contributions.
No, it was related to that question of Philip when we were talking about the free energy principle. I would ask about this level of adaptation and the species, because at some point at the chapter he makes the difference between living beings and life, and we were talking about the cycles of life, this anticipation level of life. And I was wondering if this anticipation can be seen as the possibility or the potency for new species to appear. Because he talks about this unfolding as something like the life itself, not living beings only.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and this basically opens up the question of where do you draw the line between, say, the basin of a given species, yeah, and how one goes into another, and I have no idea how to answer that.
He seems committed at certain earlier chapters to a kind of fundamental essentialism of form that would make radical, as I could see it, radical changes of body plan and species and so forth, somewhat problematic on his analysis. But he doesn't go into this much in depth. Maybe he does someplace else, but at least that's the way I was reading what he was saying. And so it would be that there's some kind of collision with what he's arguing and what we might call a general kind of evolutionism. But I don't know if that is an accurate reading, but somehow I'm reading him is what he's saying there.
I think that maybe also one thing that I would add with regards to this is we must never lose sight of actually what his project is. And this basically is completely easy to lose sight of because he just throws so much stuff and he doesn't go back and he doesn't remind anyone of this. But for instance, you know, with regards to what you were asking, Laura, so the relationship between, say, these contemporary models and what Plessner is doing, he would simply say, well, look, what I'm trying to do is I'm kind of trying to lay out a certain certain characteristics of phenomena that we call vital, and I'm trying to show how you can basically elucidate them from some basic characteristic, the most fundamental characteristic, which is boundedness, which is positiveness. Yeah, and he would say, you know, if you kind of study this, you would get to this idea of being within and being out beyond, and out beyond has a temporal dimension, which means that the living being is always not yet, and because it's not yet, it is always also in the realm of actual possibility. What's coming is not completely novel to it and stuff like that. But I'm not in any way or form trying to provide an explanatory account for this. I'm not interested in what Timothy was saying. You know, I'm not trying to say the organism is trying to minimize its entropy. This is not what I'm doing. I don't, you know, at this point, I don't really care. Maybe somebody can then elucidate this. I'm just trying to, you know, the Germans would probably say, I'm just interested in the formal structures. Like the formal structures are of interest to me. I'm doing a very expanded Kantian project, so I can elucidate how the organism is related to temporality and spatiality, but I can't really tell you about, you know, how he does this. So what the mechanism would be for that, and what the say causal account would be underpinning some of these processes. He would even say it's a category mistake to kind of try to account for what I'm doing by causal mechanisms. You might say, you might develop a causal model for it, but it's not the same, you know. It's you're working within the structures that I'm kind of trying to articulate here. You're implicitly presupposing them and working within them and develop certain models, and then you say, I've provided an account. You haven't, he would say, in my opinion. I don't know, but he would just say, you know, we're kind of operating on very different levels, and we can come together productively, maybe, because what I'm doing might be of interest to you. And, you know, actually the three energy principle would be precisely, he would say, see some of the formal characteristics that I was pointing out are basically integrated into this particular model. So if scientists would listen to this beforehand, they would kind of maybe be closer to this, and it's very useful also as a scientific endeavor. But he would say, let's not mix the approaches. My approach is of a very different kind.
Maybe this is kind of related to the part where he discusses the ectropism of life, where he kind of makes this distinction when on one hand, yeah, in intuition, qualitatively, we see life as increasing its mass, its energy, its what are all the other things, its shape, but it is still, he says, it's still in a way subservient to the principle of entropy. But this is not really the level where we're looking at life in this methodology. We're looking at an intuitive level and what we can deduce from that.
Precisely, that's a really good point. That's precisely this, because he would say he kind of opposes the idea or an attempt to introduce a counterbalancing physical force, something that would counterbalance entropy. Yeah, he would say this is a categorical mistake. I have no problem whatsoever talking about entropy, but it's a qualitative feature. It's not an entropy still has to hold. So in that regard, he's very respectful of natural sciences. Yeah, he doesn't want to meddle with that. He will, and again, why is he saying this? Because Dries said precisely that entelechy can operate within the physical world and actually change the physical parameters. This is something he doesn't want to go down that route. So he's constantly trying to, you know, find a way to dodge this possibility of ending up in a vitalist position, but at the same time keeping a very respectful distance from Köhler.
This might explain to me why Delbruck would be recommending this book to Bohr in the early 1930s. Here, it's precisely the point where the debates between Schrödinger, Jordan, Bohr are breaking out over the nature of the relation of physical and biological. And your point here makes it very interesting, is that if he's really trying to, and I think this point of what is it, the relationships to entropy and this ectropy, I think what he called it, this actually might be an illuminating as to why this might have been an interest to physicists that were trying to develop some account that was not going to be reductive, because that was the issue that comes up both that particularly with Schrödinger. He's first formulating the arguments for that later appears What is Life in 1933. And it's interesting that this would have been just an interesting context here where he could have been actually, you know, I said it's totally puzzling to me otherwise why Delbruck would have recommended this to Bohr and said he ought to read it. And
yeah, he probably saw a possible something there, like a possible path at least. I think that this is basically the greatest merit of Plessner, not in the sense of taking on board his whole project, which if I'm completely honest, I think it's a failed project. It doesn't succeed. So it's not, he hasn't managed to do the deductions that he's trying to do. They just come across as very arbitrary at some point. But
how dare you?
some of the things that he's doing, that's interesting. That's very intriguing and worth looking into.
Yeah, I was thinking about this thing as well. For example, like going a step back, when scientists struggle with life. So why do we struggle with this phenomenon so much? Because we're looking at it from two different perspectives. On the one hand, we're trying to, I feel like we're trying to explain the phenomena that appear to us in intuition on this qualitative level, and constantly trying to reduce them in the language of the, I don't know, of the physical sciences. And I think that this, especially this point about ectropism and entropy, this kind of illustrates this, how we are torn between these two perspectives, and how it's difficult to, we're trying to piece them together. And this is maybe some a methodological point which Plessner raises throughout the entire work.
I would just put out the question if anybody has any further comments or reflections on the organs. But by the way, Timothy and Le, what's that notion in Deleuze, the body without organs? Yeah. Well, according to Plessner, that's one
Dividing
word.
that other, yeah.
That's one word. This is something I was thinking of. Yeah.
Out of the picture.
Ash, you already gone.
I was exactly thinking about the organs and how it doesn't, it was very clear from your explanation, but I still felt like, oh, I don't have the insight. I'm not getting there. So I've been thinking about that myself. And as you mentioned, there is some kind of, it feels arbitrary. Why organs? And the definition he provides, well, that's also like, okay, still quite general. And I was thinking, well, what can we do with that? Can we go, can we retain the principle but change the contents? I was thinking, can we go kind of lower level of discernment to cells, or even DNA or something like that? Would you agree? Or how can we react to this arbitrariness or this unsatisfactory feeling? And I may add one more point. There is a person known maybe to you, David Sinclair. He's working on DNA. He's a scientist, and he is he's quite famous because of his research on aging. And basically, he's saying aging and disease are X differentiations. So it's a loss of differentiation. And this for me, as like I react to this maybe perhaps too much philosophical way, but it reminds me Goldstein, because he was also talking about pathology as that de-differentiation, the loss of differentiation. This was taken up by Merleau-Ponty as well. So there is this relationship between health and differentiation. Health means that there are differences within the body, and they are maintained and also perhaps developed. Increased, and in contrast to that, disease would be a loss of these functional oppositions within the body. And we can see this on the level of organs, but we could go a bit kind of deeper and look into some smaller units within the organism. So this is what I suggest as what can we do with this arbitrariness of the organs, and what about health? Does it have any implications for health and disease? This kind of idea about life.
I think we have to be I'm not sure that we have a wide enough conception of what he means by organs. It's not like specific organs of the human body or any animal, but organs in the most general sense of a subunit of the living body, which is used as a means towards the whole's end. So it can include parts of the cell. I think we discussed this last time. Phil made a very good point, because I misunderstood this initially. I thought that organs are really just on the level of multicellular beings, where we really have these specific parts of the body. But it can be meant in this very general sense of a subunit with its own, with a specific function and a specific, yeah. So even a cell can be broken up into its organs, and it has its own organs, which we call organelles, because they're not so independent.
Look, the main point, Jan, with regards to organs, from what I understood, is the following. So if you have, say, a physical gestalt, right? Basically, for example, you can have some sort of a field, magnetic field or electrofield or whatever. And the thing is that all the aspects or all the segments of that field are in a certain sense equipotential. There's no specialization within them. So the whole is immediately present in all of them, which means that if you change one, all the rest have to change with regards to the whole. What he needs is precisely what you said. He needs differentiation. And this is what organs introduce. He needs something that introduces some sort of autonomy. Why? Because then the whole is not immediately present, but mediately present. This is crucial for him. He needs this mediacy. Yeah. Why does he need this mediacy? Because otherwise you would not have this. Okay, thanks, Phil, and please do circulate that. That would be very, very good. Yeah, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Good.
Oh, bye. So this mediacy, I think, is really important for him, because this is precisely what allows for this, prevents this coalescing with itself. It always allows it to be over and above while at the same returning. Yeah, so to be in this dynamism. But you're right, Jan. Your intuition was correct, and Primož nicely supplemented this. So the organs are basically, in a certain sense, whatever provides differentiation, whatever it is that provides differentiation. As soon as you have differentiation in the meaningful sense of having specialized sub-autonomous units, then you have something that would count as an organ. And then you have a very specific whole, which is mediate. Yeah. And this is what he kind of needs, because this anchors it. No longer is the whole immediately determinative of everything. All of a sudden, the parts also start kind of having their own weight. But at the same time, it is still something that is present everywhere, because they're not completely autonomous. As for what you were asking about, and this, I would really appreciate if others could chime in on this, about health. So, when he was talking about health and disease and death and whatnot, I think he was talking about like a curve. So I'm guessing that here's how I'm understanding this. So the systemic whole is an actual possibility, and then the functional whole is actuality. You have process of unfolding. With each cycle, the possibility is narrow, and you reach a certain point where differentiation is optimal. And then after that point, basically the organism is not as plastic. So basically after that, the possibilities become less and less and less until they're kind of exhausted. So he would say differentiation in itself is not enough. It is basically something that is part of the temporal circle, I guess. I don't know. This is just like the only thing that I came up with when you were talking about this. But you know what I mean? So it's for him, it's about these cycles that occur, and you have development of organs, which kind of make the organ more and more and more and more dense. But then after a while, I guess you reach a certain point where it becomes too rigid, or what? I don't know.
Yeah, thanks. Well, that's something to think about. whether the more differentiation brings more kind of fixed state of affairs. I would go, I think it should be the opposite. It should be more flexible. But
what about cancer?
Yeah, that's de-differentiation.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's a good point. That's de-differentiation.
Yeah, because the cells are just general cells. They are losing their they are something that shouldn't be at that place in the organ.
Sure. Yeah. Good point. You're right on that. Yeah. So, any other thoughts on this?
I mean, yeah, I had some troubles because, first of all, I had trouble understanding, like, yeah, of course, I'm in agreement with you all who said that it seemed arbitrary in the sense that just looking at the two types of holes he's trying to mediate here, I don't see any problem why they couldn't be just mediated in the sense of one being enveloped in the other, in the sense that you have this synchronous structure, and this has a certain way of developing, unfolding, and this temporal pattern you could call the Dresian hole, right? I wouldn't see any problem with that. But then I started thinking, like, when you were talking about differentiation, that maybe there's I don't know if this is really a Plessnerian point, but there may be a point to be made here that any kind of homogeneous gestalt could only unfold very statically. Like, you couldn't really have any types of dynamics. And here I was reminded by cyberneticians who were very developing these notions of like adaptivity, and they were a very important point for them was that you had to have some very like asymmetrically structured agents, in the sense that you had to have a central controller and something being controlled. That was part of the synchronous structure of any kind of adaptive agent. And this meant that the temporal unfoldment of his life was such that the controller encoded those things that needed to stay the same. And the controlled part, let's say peripheral organs, were those who were able to permutate, able to change so as to keep the essential structures fixed. So you had the kind of unfolding process which had this dual aspect, like once some sort of essential variables and some peripheral permutable periphery that was actually needed to respond. Like it needed to be permutable so that it could be adaptive to respond to some permutable external perturbations. So I don't know if that.
No, Timothy, but actually that's in a certain sense that's a good point, because what you've just described is very close to what Plessner will call a closed form. So closed form will be structured in such a way where, in addition to what I've described, like this dialectics between systemic unity or the center and the functional unity, yeah, the gestalt and this central ego, you will have an additional split. So there's a split within a split where where what happens basically is precisely what you described. You get a center separated from the periphery. So within the gestalt itself, you get a separation. And within it, you get something that is very similar to what you were saying. And this is really important because from the way I understand it, think like there are several different ways of thinking about teleology, right? And one of them is on the level of individual. Cool, I don't understand it. Let's put it aside. But if I understand him correctly, there is a certain teleology in the logics of the boundedness. And it's implicitly present that you will have different forms within it. So for instance, you know, the animal, the plant form, which is an open form, does not really actualize the logics of the living to the same degree that the animal form does. So this centeredness that happens, it will be something that will kind of have several shifts within it. So implicitly, you know, already in the animal form, you will have something that is similar to the animal, sorry, in the plant form, you will have something that is present in the animal form, but only in the animal form will it explicate itself in a certain sense. And then in the human form, you will have a further explication of something that is implicitly present already in the animal form. So what you're describing is already present on this general level of what I've described, but only implicitly, Plessner would say. It explicates itself only when this split happens again within the gestalt itself. Yeah. So in this regard, I guess differentiation is really crucial. Or what? I don't know. But yeah, this is basically, Timothy, this is very close to the closed form, what you described, the periphery and center, and basically periphery in a certain sense representing certain parts of the whole, but not the whole of it. So you get like a weird additional twist in everything that I'll have to somehow describe next time. So yeah.
I'm not quite clear on one point, and maybe someone can explain it. Why do you think this introduction of organs is arbitrary? What's the arbitrary part of it? I'm not sure what exactly this critique is aiming at. Whoever used it, everyone at some point.
I mean, for me, it was just unclear why the conceptual, I mean, why he needed to introduce the concept of organism, of organ at this point. What was its explanatory value for the mediating between the two kinds of wholes he was trying to synthesize?
Yeah, to wrap my mind around it. I mean, because it didn't strike me as arbitrary. So we have a living being, and it is trying to maintain its boundary, it's positioning itself, and the only means it has to do this are its organs. So whatever its differentiations are. So in this sense, I don't see where the arbitrary part comes in here.
I mean, I understand organs not only as means in the sense of material instantiation, whatever that may be, but the kind of structure that partially insulates parts so that they aren't in immediate contact or communication with each other. In the sense that what happens in one organ doesn't immediately correspond to something happening somewhere else in the body. So I mean, the physical gestalts, like the gestalts were describing mostly, I think, I'm not really sure, but I think that they were explicitly aimed to describe structures that have this synchronous action of every part on every other part of the structure. So like the kind of field dynamics or in like electromagnetism and stuff like that. But here is precisely the question is how do you get from this kind of synchronous action of everything on everything else to something that is more mediated, structured.
Yeah, precisely, because he's kind of, the main problem for him is precisely, I don't want to end up with the Gestalt structure. So this is something I am not okay with, but I mustn't end up with something that would sever the tie. So I have to find something in the organism that will operate with it, that will allow me to have this mediate position. And he just says, well, it's the organ, you know. And I can get the logics when he's trying to kind of develop why he's introducing it. But the problem is he's trying to deduce categories. I don't see the deduction. It seems just like, well, what else can do the function? You know, I don't see is this truly in what way is this does this necessarily follow? I can see why he would say precisely this can do this function, right? Although even there I would have some questions, but and also there's a bit of a, I don't know if you had the same impression, but it's a slight slay of a hand what he does there with introducing positional field and the life circle, you know, where he kind of says, okay, so now we finally established that the organs are the topoi where this happens, and these organs, they're actually semi-autonomous, which means they're open, and because they're open to everything else, the organism as a gestalt structure that has a specific organs has to be open as well, and it's open to the positional field. Ergo, we have a larger whole. It's just like you did it. He does that in one paragraph. Okay, sure. So later on, he's kind of trying to describe what this means and how this could take place. But it's funny how he uses, I don't know how many paragraphs to kind of try to convey this organ part, and then the positional field and the circulation of life is just like, you know, in one paragraph he solves it. Yeah, then just you have this and then you have this. So yeah, quite a lot of presupposed stuff there, I guess. Timothy, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was trying to articulate the question. I think I can. So I would like to return, maybe if anybody has like thoughts on this, to the question of transcendentalism, or what's actually Plessner is trying to do here. So previously, some of you were arguing for this position, that this isn't really an empirical account, and it seems to me like I mean, it's very hard for me to draw this distinction, especially when it comes to phenomena of life. Like, one thing I was thinking before was that, like, this is one way of differentiating his position to Varela's, where Varela would explicitly deny this opposition in the sense that what he's doing is some sort of formal description of organisms, but this form is actually is causally efficient, in the sense, like Hans Jonas says, if the forms becomes the form of the organism becomes the cause of its existence, and in this sense it's empirical as well as transcendental, right? Because it describes the causal mechanisms by which the organism perpetuates itself, as well as its like conditions of possibility of describing it, right? So I was thinking here, like, I don't know, I mean, how would you even draw this distinction? Like, why would you say that? I mean, on what ground would you separate the empirical stuff from whatever Plessner is doing? That's my question.
I mean, that's probably related to the second chapter where we dealt with Cartesian, where we can understand this empirical perspective in a very narrow manner of just like, I think if he talks about just focusing on sensuous intuition, on the sensible parts of our empirical input in a certain way, whereas here he's focusing on this very particular thing that is given to us in intuition, and on this qualitative level, not just trying to reduce things to sensible, to sensory empirical data, but being kind of, I guess, wider in his perspective. That's my take on it. And then on this intuitive qualitative level, we see certain, he kind of presupposes a certain phenomenon and tries to deduce all the other phenomena of life based on that. That's the deductive part, I guess.
Yeah, I think that maybe one of the things that Plessner might have asked here is when you say cause, what kind of a cause is it? you know, you can say that it causes itself, but are you still operating with the same cause, or are you just using the term because you want to remain your account within a certain framework? So he would probably kind of call him out on not necessarily on something that Primož mentioned, basically on the fact that when you start talking about organization and whatnot, that you're kind of switching gears. It's philosophically problematic to simply start introducing notions such as, for instance, circular causality or maybe organization, and putting them on the same level as you had previous structures in the, say, mechanical account. So by simply solving the problem by extending this, even if you introduce, for instance, the dynamical systems theory, he would say, well, what exactly are they doing? Is the game of science the same, in the sense of, is the epistemology of science the same? They might use the same categories, and they might even pretend that this is the case, but is it? So he would kind of press them probably on that.
Yeah, I mean, my response, a quick response would be that the issue I take with this is precisely like, is the flip side of this, is that he concedes too much to the naturalist, like the notion of entropy, for example. Like, why would you concede that this is like something this notion doesn't pertain to some essential characteristic of that doesn't come into play when you deduce the categories of vital existence? And isn't this notion itself tied to a specific like to an understanding of causality that does incorporate some sort of structural features of the world? Like, I mean, in the sense that is this talking about some sort of organization as well? So here I would say that this is, it becomes problematic for me. Like, where do you draw the line between what pertains to the scientist and his way of describing the world and the philosophical framework you're building?
Yeah, I think that maybe, you know, given the fact that he's kind of trying to move away from both extremes by this trying to open up this middle space where he's kind of trying to do some sort of an a prioristic project, but within, say, certain morphological structures or something like that. I think that he uses this example of entropy, if you remember, in one of the earlier chapters, where he says that even though it's something that was discovered empirically, at the end it's an a priori law. And I think that, you know, probably it has something to do with that. So you kind of you can discover certain morphologies empirically, but then you kind of, if you want to understand them, you have to apply the philosophical method, because the scientific method, which operates within the sensual domain, will not go as far. I mean, it can do it, but it will not be aware that it's doing it. So maybe he would say to Varela, you basically were already doing some of the stuff that I was doing, right? You just kind of weren't thematizing some of the things that you were doing and weren't perhaps methodologically attuned to what this was. And even this would not be the case, maybe necessarily, for the late Varela, which started then, you know, kind of doing more and more reflections of this nature. So I don't know, but it's a good question. The thing is that he definitely, you know, by my saying that what he's doing is different from what the scientist is doing, that doesn't mean that it is kind of, he's trying to withdraw into a transcendentalist position, but that he's kind of trying to explicate what he calls a priori forms. So these, although he usually says that a priori forms are not mental forms. Yeah, it's basically something that is kind of that all the life phenomena have to conform to as a fundamental, I don't know, dynamism or whatever.
I think an important question is that where would he get the notion of entropy from? Like, when he is doing his analysis based on how life gives itself an intuition and all that stuff, how would entropy come into question? So he would have to sort of apply it to the explanation of the structure of life. I think his kind of qualm about that would be, why would I introduce a concept from another science that has appeared on a different kind of level of analysis into my analysis of life? Let me look at life and intuition, deduce the forms, and then see if this form of entropy appears, and it's in this sense kind of part of the essential structure of life. Because I think in this chapter, what he says that is actually what appears to us on this level of analysis is not entropy in life, but the ectropism of life. Life doesn't give itself as though it's bound to entropy, but as though it's increasing its energy, increasing its mass. So why would he suddenly just say, okay, but the physicists say that I have to apply entropy here because all physical matter. So basically says, let's put it aside. This is not the level of analysis we're at. Let's focus on what is giving. Let's focus on. Let's stay on our level of analysis. That's how I would think about it.
That's a nice explanation. I mean, you convinced me in the sense like where the distinction is crucial for him. And maybe I've been talking past his. I mean, the thing I take issue with is the distinction between transcendentalism and empiricism, right? But here he's explicitly saying that he's trying to articulate like how life what are the structures of life in our intuition. So there's another distinction to be made between intuitive perception of life and scientific descriptions of life, right? So this is, I guess, that the caveat that is actually crucial here for the division of labor between the philosopher and the scientist that we're talking about, I guess.
How would you
which is something I would take issue with. I mean, this is thoroughly unconvincing to me. I wanted to add. So, why would you divide the labor? I mean, here I would just say, yeah. So, but this is basically what you're doing is psychologism. Is like you're describing your personal intuitions about stuff. So, how is that relevant?
That's his problem that he explains in the beginning, that given with the perspective of the empirical sciences as it was at the time, we weren't able to kind of approximate life. So he tried kind of bracketed that this what he says, the methodological sensualism away, and try to kind of take his own course, which would maybe be more productive in trying to explain life.
And his point will basically be that the categories that are given in this particular way are ontological. So if they are basically the type of categories that will be able to account for all the inessential and essential characteristics of life, then you have basically no reason why you would say that just because this is a new qualitative order, it's not ontological. So this is not the case that this is something that is just, he's describing his categories. He thinks that these categories actually pertain to a meaningful sense of reality. However, this reality needs to be understood precisely in the light of what he's trying to do, where he's trying to move away from this split of inner, outer, and open up the middle domain. And he would say this is where ontology happens. And natural scientists will claim, no, it's only what eventually can be accounted for in the domain of what he calls empirical or sensual intuition. But he says, why would this be the case? Like, why would this be the case? And he provides like even these examples with colors, what he would claim, the colors have their own ontology. And you can also describe them in a specific way, but why would you say that they are kind of excluded from existence? Especially given the fact that that the dynamism and the quality and the texture and the specific givenness of the colors simply cannot be translated into that. So something gets lost. And just because an observer needs to be present doesn't mean that necessarily it's just subjective. That's his point. So observer can be present for bringing something about, but that just means that you would say that in order for something to happen, certain conditions need to be met.
and observer is one of them. And that's basically it. Also, for other phenomena, you need specific conditions. But the question is whether you can account for this phenomenon by means of these conditions. So this is his point. You can only say this is merely subjective if you subscribe, according to him, to the specific Cartesian picture. If you try to get out of it, this doesn't necessarily hold. At least this is what he's trying to do. I'm just trying to kind of show you what the impetus behind him is. Yeah. So I don't know. Again, yeah, if this is convincing, and I honestly think that this. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's convincing, and it seems that I've maybe misunderstood his general approach, because what I took to be Primož's point was that he is interested in the structure of appearing, of sensuous appearing of living beings. And in this sense, you could make this argument that I'm not interested in notions such as entropy, even if there's some physicists out there who are explicitly applying this to domains of life. But if you're not doing this, I mean, if you're not, if you're trying to be ontological about it, then I think you cannot make this move. You have to at least confront the possibility that notions such as entropy could be essential, like could pertain essentially to what you're trying to describe. There isn't any essential difference between the domain you are positioning yourself into and the domain of the physicist, for me.
Yeah, that's a good point. The thing is, so the tricky notion here is probably intuition. But, you know, what Primož was saying was, he was talking about sensuous intuition as something that pertains to, say, a natural scientist, whereas you can still elucidate intuitive structures, this is how he would call them, without them necessarily be sensuous. And you can be doing ontological work, provided that if you find categories that actually allow you to then deduce certain other, or show how other categories can be deduced in a way that is meaningful. He never defines what he means by deduction, by the way, but there you have it. So according to him, the point here is that it's more about, you know, having, he calls them these models, or these qualitative irreducibles, right? And this is something that he would say it can be given in intuition, although it cannot be encapsulated or captured by sensuous intuition. So, you know, when he's talking about, he's using these Husserlian examples and whatnot, just to make a point, to show what he's aiming at, right? Where you have something that is intuitive, but it is not reducible to what is real, what is sensuously given, yeah? And even with regards to the law that you were mentioning, for him, that particular law is something that you can discover empirically, but elucidate only philosophically, as a law that pertains in general and universal, and its universal structure. That's why it's a priori, he would say. And for him, if I understand him correctly, when you have phenomena, the a priori and a posteriori are intermingled in a certain sense. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, spherical. I think uses the term. The categories are spherical unities of the subject and the object, and that's that kind of language. But yeah, the deductive part and the transcendental part, that's really, it was hard for me to wrap my mind around that. But in relation to this, about the sensuous intuition and intuition in a wider sense, I think we can go back to the boundary, which I think is a very illustrative point in Plessner, where he really, I think he makes it pretty explicit that we shouldn't look at a boundary like some specific physical boundary in space, like the skin or the membrane of the cell. That's not the boundary we're really looking at, although that may have been the psychochemical basis of the original emergence of the boundedness of life. But boundedness is an intuitive phenomenon. It's something you see on the level of the whole, which is giving itself to you, and this is the living whole. So maybe this is in the last chapter, I think, the talk about boundaries. And that's maybe a good way to try to get down this notion. What is he seeing in intuition actually, and why is this so different from the empirical scientist? Because he's never really looking for like some physical boundary when he's talking about this.
Any last thoughts on this matter or something else? See, Jan moved closer to the camera. No?
It doesn't mean I have a question.
No, maybe a comment, or maybe you wanted to add something.
No, I was thinking maybe we could have a special session dedicated to Plessner's method, because I'm also struggling with understanding the a priori and these claims. Very bold for me.
Okay. Maybe we could really do that. Yeah. Maybe. Do you think maybe towards the end that we could maybe have that?
Sounds good.
And just try to identify the parts where he talks about it and try to make sense of that.
That would be amazing.
It would be.
Yeah. And also like the idea of deduction, like you're saying, he's not deducting, but what does he mean by deduction? And also like you were talking about ontology, but he talks about like ontic, not ontologic. So I don't know why is he making this distinction if it's like Heidegger, like after like how Heidegger maybe distinguished between ontic and ontologic, but I don't know. Why is he using ontic?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you for certain, but the way I understand it is that maybe ontological pertains to these say fundamental structure of life, and then ontic would be just, you know, how it manifests itself in its particularity as a certain, I don't know, it could be, I'm guessing. So for instance, the positionality, right, this would be at the level of ontology, because it would be a category that pertains to being in general, whereas then you have something that then is kind of manifesting itself in the plethora of different living beings, I guess.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, but that would be very useful. I agree about the question about methodology. And also, you know, what would be really useful is if we tried, for instance, then to take two examples, concrete examples, and let's agree already on those examples. One could be just the theory of autopoiesis, and the other one could be the theory about the one that we talked now about. What's it called again? Yeah, free energy principle, and try to see how Plessner might have articulated this. So how would he, you know, you have like these two theories that do something that comes close to some of the things that he's doing. So what would he say?
That sounds like a paper.
Yeah, even a book. I agree on. Yeah, it's true. It's true. So, okay, let's try to do that. Okay, shall we wrap this up? Yeah, thank you very much for coming, everyone. See you in a week, and be well till then. Yeah, bye. Ciao.